Hello everyone, and welcome from me, Curtis Hutchinson, and Philip Nothard to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast interview. Many thanks for joining us for this weekday special. We're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retailing and After-Sales Consultancy, for our monthly chat about some of the trends impacting the car retailing sector. So welcome back to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. It's been it feels like a long time since we last spoke with a king, a new prime minister, a new government, and a heap of other things going on. So, but glad to be back.
Yeah, no, good to have you back, and yeah, it certainly has been a busy time.
And a house move for yourself, Steve. You're giving up your 1,000 megabyte download for something a little bit slower and giving up the time to speak to us whilst in the middle of it. So I appreciate that.
No, that's not a problem. We've managed to do something better than a string and two tin cans, but it's But unfortunately, technology has not reached where I live now.
Well, I mean, as Curtis said, great to have you back on. And like you say, you know, it's only been a month since we last spoke, but it does seem a long time with a lot of things happening in between. So we want to try and obviously, you know, come back to a few blogs that you've done recently, and for anyone listening that have not had sight of the blogs, please do check out the ICDP website for these blogs and read them in their entirety, and you can subscribe so you can receive them through your email. But if we look at one of them about customer service, or should we say the lack of it, based on some recent experience you had with a premium brand, can you take us through briefly what your thoughts were on what's typically wrong with customer service and how it can remedy it in many ways?
I think it's the issue is that the customer service is not customer focused. Is probably the long and the short of it. So we, and this, our industry is not unique in this, but if we talk about automotive retail and the manufacturers and dealers together and the independents who form part of that, then we tend to think as an industry around some sort of idealized process and then measure performance against that process and even incentivize performance being adherent to that process. And there's not within that, there's not actually the attention to what the customer wants, which is very likely not to be consistent with whatever that idealized process is. So we end up measuring, ticking boxes against, did you respond in so many rings? Did you do the handover in a particular way? Do you, were all the things dealt with on the car and so on? And that's not necessarily, obviously customers do want the car handed over and they do want the car, repaired or serviced properly, but exactly how that happens and how they interact with the provider, that varies hugely. We're not talking about production line. We're talking about individual customers with individual needs, some of them more complex, some with more or less preparation before they have that contact. And we should focus on what customers actually want and whether we met their individual expectations rather than focusing on some process and did we tick the boxes in the process.
So you think, so this is more then about attitude towards the customer rather than, like you say, have I handed over, the service book? Is it done the stamps? Is it this? Is it done? And that whole process. It sounds like you're talking more about this point of attitude of this relationship towards the customer.
Well, it comes down to attitude in the end, but it actually starts off with flexibility and sensitivity and empathy, if you like. There's a minimum standard that we should always deliver, and we should, if we're talking about buying a car, then it's the right car, right place, right time, right price. If it's a service, then it's right first time, on time, and those are the minimum standards. And a happy customer is a customer where, of course, you've done those things, but then also you've done it and handled it in the way that was important to them. So, they've not had to queue for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, to get the car checked in with the service advisor. They've not been asked exactly the same questions all over again that they already were asked when they booked the car in by phone, perhaps. And so we put barriers to satisfaction up there, through following sort of rigid processes. And, I think that's where it starts to fall down. And if you take someone like, the top hotel groups, Ritz-Carlton or Four Seasons or whatever, and you Google their, the stuff that's on the net about customer satisfaction, it's never about the basics. Of course your room will be clean. Of course it will be, they will welcome you, and they will get you up to the room promptly and all these other things. But the stories are always about, and I had this particular requirement, and this is how they went the extra mile. And that's where I think we're missing something, and that comes down then to the quality of the staff, the flexibility that you give the staff, rather than trying to fence them in tightly to a rigid process, and some discretion for them to handle the customer and handle the customer's particular issues in the way that they want.
So I suppose that does bring to a point that you make that point of hire for attitude or fire for attitude, that there should be more that element in the employing and maintenance of that employee towards the customer.
No, absolutely. It's you can train people in terms of skills. It's not easy to turn someone who's in their very nature not empathetic, doesn't, is not a natural listener, and so on. It's difficult to train that into somebody. So you need to hire people who've got the right mindset, and then you can train them. You can train them in product, you can train them in process, you can train them in the systems. And then they'll be a top performer. And what I've found frustrating over the years, and this is not a new thing, this is, goes back many years, is that if you talk to dealer heads, or even people in the manufacturers, then they will have anecdotes where they said, we hired this guy from a restaurant. Went into this restaurant, got really good service, and said, anytime you're looking for a change of scene, then give me a call. Things like, I won't say high fashion. I don't mean in the sense of, Bond Street, but sort of more personal clothing stores and things like that, where there is a requirement to actually build a relationship with the customer. You're asking what's the occasion of buying the clothes for, or what their particular taste is in food, and you're having a proper discussion. And there's lots of anecdotes quoted to me by heads of dealer groups where they've hired somebody in with those sorts of attributes, that background, and then very quickly they're at the top of the CSI rankings in the dealership, and 6 months later they're at the top of the sales ranking as well, because the sales performance follows the customer service. And it might take them a little while to get used to how you explain the features on the car, and to be able to understand how one might fit a customer needs better than another. But that is trainable. But it starts off from the foundation that they built a relationship with the customer. And yet, with that experience, the industry has been quite slow to think about the profile of the people that they hire. And it comes back in part to targeting and sales volumes and so on, that they actually have what we called a start Monday attitude. So we'll have anyone that we can get, as long as they can start Monday. So if they've got experience in the industry, great. If they've got experience in the brand, even better. And if they can start Monday, that's perfect, because I've got someone back in there, trying to rack up the numbers for this month. And that's not the way to run a business and deliver good customer service. We need a profile at the beginning that says these are the sorts of people that we need to build relationships with the customers, to build a strong business, and hire against that profile. Proactively go out and hire against that profile, not just run into somebody in a restaurant and say, if you want a job, give me a call.
And just briefly before we talk about one of the other blogs, but how far? I mean, I've got experience myself in employing people for their attitude, and then let them learn the automotive industry and that side of things, because they just they had that right focus and attitude and empathy in terms of talking to people and getting on with them. Do you think there's still a long way for our industry to go then? Do you know? I mean, because obviously there's dealer groups that will be listening this morning. There'll be dealers that have got meters and greeters, changed that whole profile. We saw, if we look at Lookers many years ago, that started to think about the more John Lewis kind of customer facing process. Do you think there's still a long way for this sector to go then in that world?
I'd have to acknowledge that there's been good progress. That you have within NFDA you've got sort of an HR sort of working group who are trying to share best practices, and we've had some a number of quite high profile hires into the big dealer groups from outside of the sector who are bringing a fresh approach to HR and to recruitment and training, particularly compared to that we're used to. So we are making progress. We're also making progress in terms of getting away from the old sort of low base, high commission model, which doesn't help either. I mean, that encourages churn in the employees. So we're making progress, but that still means there's a long way to go, because you've got quite an expensive product, quite complex product, quite complex service requirements, and the potential for issues around particular faults or concerns, and that needs to be addressed by good quality people.
And Steve, in the follow-up blog, because I understand you had quite a bit of feedback on the first blog about customer service, and you've already touched on this, but I wonder if we can look at it in a bit more detail. You talk about something that will definitely resonate with listeners who are constantly battling to adhere to OEM standards. So do you think as an industry we're actually measuring the wrong things when it comes to customer service? And you've talked about lessons to be learned from the hospitality sector, for instance. And if there are lessons to be learned, what are the solutions, do you think?
I think that in some respects, less is more when it comes down to manufacturers measuring the customer service performance of their dealerships. If you look at Suzuki's consistently ranks at the top of, or the Suzuki dealer network consistently ranks at the top of the ratings that are produced each year by the Institute for Customer Service. And Dale Wyatt's been on, I know he's been on your programs in the past. He's been on some other platforms as well, talking about this. But they basically empower the dealers. They leave the dealers to get on with it. The dealers are not stupid. They understand that good customer service is good business. And they do not need to be measured all the time in order to deliver good customer service. And they've done that consistently, over a number of years, and to a standard which is higher than lots of, high street brands that we're all familiar with and we sort of associate with good customer service. So some of the brands who've got KPIs and bonuses in sort of micro amounts, 0.5% for this and 0.5% for that, are not actually performing in the real world in that high level of customer service. I'm sure there's some people in the manufacturers who are patting themselves on the back and saying, "Oh, look how this particular KPI is trending upwards. It's trending upwards because you set it as a KPI, and the dealers are not stupid. If there's some money associated with it, they'll make damn sure they meet that KPI, and we all understand the gaming that goes on. The salesman who says, "Oh, please, score me a 5 or score me a 10, or you're going to get a call in the next 2 days," and all this stuff, and it's all complete bollocks, putting it frankly.
And Steve, that's a really interesting point that you make, especially about Suzuki and Dale Wyatt. And we had Dale on the show just the last week. And one of the things that he did make really, really clear, and he's done this on a number of times, is that importance of delivering consistent customer care, high levels of customer service, but also his sort of hands-off, not micromanaging what the dealers are doing. So is there a lesson to be learnt by other OEMs? Because Suzuki are in a position to do that because they are still a relatively small brand. But when you get to some of the bigger volume or premium brands, maybe that sort of hands-off approach is totally against their sort of cultural interests.
I agree. I agree. It's a cultural issue. I thought your question was going to go in a slightly different direction, and you're going to sort of say that because they're bigger, then they need to do things. And there, I would have disagreed with you. But it's not in their culture. You have people who are responsible for, broadly speaking, for CSI, and so obviously, in order to justify the fact that they're responsible for CSI, they need to have some measures, and they need to have some money, and they need to go out and rough up some dealers occasionally. And but that does not mean that is the right way to do business. And I don't think Four Seasons Hotels is not a small business. They're big hotels, and it's a big international group, but it gives superb customer service because they hire the right people in the first place and then empower them to get on and deliver that customer service. So size does not mean that you then have to have lots of measures. I think that size means that you fall into the trap of having lots of measures, and perhaps also brings a degree of arrogance that you know better than the people who are actually at the coalface, and that's where it starts to fall over.
So, do you feel that as an industry in the car retailing sector has an over reliance on measuring failure rather than success? That this is about you didn't do that, so therefore you've not got that. You didn't do this, so therefore you're not getting that money, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, but it's failure to achieve an artificial baseline. So if you achieve the baseline, if you score 100% and you're top of the custom manufacturer CSI league table, that does not equate to customers who are genuinely happy and have become advocates for the business and say you must go along to, Philip Nothard Motors or Curtis Hutchinson cars. It is measuring the wrong thing, but it is then measuring failure against it. And more to the point, it's not just that it's measuring failure, but it then just comes out with a stick and says, beat you up, you're not getting some money. The importance of measuring something is to improve it. And if there's something which you think is important, then yes, measure it, but then understand that when it does go wrong, why did it go wrong, and how can you improve it? So, if my original background is as an engineer and coming out of manufacturing, and there's a technique called failure mode and effects analysis, FMEA. We should be applying that. We should be looking at the what could go wrong, what did go wrong, how do we make sure it doesn't go wrong again in future? And it's that correction loop which is important. And the correction loop that we have today is basically you missed out on some of your bonuses last month or last quarter. Don't do it again next quarter. That's not a correction loop. That's just a cycle of punishment.
And moving on to one of your other recent blogs, Steve, it went under the title, "Is 100% EV a realistic target?" Now, I was particularly interested in this because you were talking about a recent experience of yours in Greece. I know you're at a classic car rally, but it enabled you to have a look on the roads to see what people are driving. And you make this point that in Greece, that it's pretty much lagging behind in terms of EV adoption. Now, I had a very similar experience just this month because I've just come back from Australia, where big 4x4s and pickups are very much the mainstream norm, and EV adoption is less than 2% of sales, with the country actually having no emissions regulations for new cars. And I was reading only this week that there's a call in Italy for a vote on whether to adopt EV rules on banning new ICE vehicles from 2035. So I'm just wondering, what's your view on how the 2030 UK target is actually looking now, and especially in the wake of the cost of living crisis and the impacts on electricity bills, and also having a new government in place.
Yeah, I think that firstly, we need to do something about climate change, and I'm not in any way trying to detract from that. But we've also got to be realistic about what can be done. If you get a country like India, for example, where they're struggling to maintain a power system for the basics, then to load and the emissions problems in places like New Delhi are horrible, then the right solution cannot be let's electrify all the cars, because that will just mean that people won't be able to light their houses, run their air conditioners or whatever. So we need to be more sensible about how we approach that. And if we come back to more locally to Europe, then Europe is a continent, but it is not a consistent continent. And in the places that we were going through in Greece or in southern Italy afterwards, then there are still lots of old cars on the road, cars that I'm sure are highly dangerous in many respects, but also in villages and small towns and so on, where you just really can't believe that they're going to be anywhere close to being able to support 100% EV sales quotas by 2035. And so I think a degree of pragmatism will come in around that. And that might also provide us some time where we get some alternative solutions coming along, like synthetic fuels that allow IC engines to continue, but still give environmental benefit. In the UK, we can't really argue that it's impossible for us to move to 100%. I think it's the legislation was framed in the wrong way originally in Europe. That's a fallout from Dieselgate. But the train's left the station. So I think we will see the ban. Will they relax it by a couple of years? I don't know. It would be a disaster for climate change if there was a wholesale abandonment of it. But we have to recognize that the fossil fuels today, I mean, whilst I acknowledge that electricity has become more expensive, and if you're charging on public networks, we're already more or less at sort of an energy parity between electric and petrol or diesel. But the petrol and diesel is today contributing £30 billion a year to the Treasury. And this morning, as we've recorded this on Friday, we've just had the mini budget, which is, slash lots of taxes and creates an even bigger hole for the government. If we move to 100% EV, then that 30 billion starts getting smaller and smaller. And at some point, they have to then put tax on electricity for energy or on the usage of electric cars. So we're not even reached the end of the road in terms of how much it costs to run an EV. An EV is still, despite the actual energy costs being similar, an EV is still subsidized by the government through the, not paying road tax and not paying any sort of duty on the energy that we use to charge the car. So how the electorate will respond to those changes when they come through, which I think they will have to by 2030, and how politicians respond to that pressure from the electorate will be a good test of their real commitment to climate change as opposed to their commitment to keeping their seat.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there. I think the early elements of this transition to EV has been about cost, and that isn't the long term reason for it. It is about climate change, isn't it? This is to your point that the parity pricing and things like this. We've had the early moves of the early adopters that have either done it because it's the right thing to do, or they want to be seen doing the right thing, or actually it's a cheaper alternative to combustion to drive an EV through their behaviours and usage, etc. But that isn't the point. And to your point, that the government will, the Treasury will have to recover that lost revenue some way down the line, because as to your point, a 30 billion deficit is a significant amount of money from the Treasury's pot that needs replacing somehow. So it's going to certainly get interesting. But remaining with electrification and EVs, and this week it's been announced that Pendragon are in advanced talks and negotiations with BYD, and BYD are one of the larger Chinese electrification brands, and we know recently they've done a deal in both Sweden and Germany with the Heading Group for distribution of their products. Now, obviously, we've got other things going on with Pendragon, with the Lithia, the US business looking to try and buy Pendragon. There's obviously been Heading the same there. But we were talking before the show, and a lot of this is obviously speculation. We don't know for a fact because we're not in there. But just to clear up, what do you think is going on in this, with one with BYD and two with sort of the Heading, Lithia and Pendragon?
Well, I think BYD is a company that most people, even people in the trade, will not necessarily have heard of, but it's been around longer than some of the other brands that people have latched onto, like NIO and so on. And I think at least at some point earlier this year, BYD overtook Tesla as the producer of the highest BEV volume producer in the world. So, they're a big major player, whereas some of these others, NIO, Xpeng, and other startups are startups. They're infants. They produce less cars in total in their combined lifetime than BYD produce in a year. So BYD is a big player, and it's big news that they're coming to Europe, and they've done it by setting up sort of single country arrangements with big distributors. And our understanding of how the model will work is that BYD will operate some big brand centers themselves, 2 or 3 perhaps, in a market, and then the distributor will provide the after sales support and also then some limited additional sales points. So they've got sort of quite an interesting entry model. The sort of Pendragon news is therefore not a surprise. It fits into that context. We don't have sort of big distributors in the way that you have people like Lauman in the Netherlands, which is also the Toyota importer, for example. But we do have big dealer groups, and Pendragon is a reasonable choice. It's got good national coverage, and it makes sense from a Pendragon point of view to do it. It makes sense from a BYD point of view. Perhaps BYD, looking at what's going on in the Hayden Pendragon sort of battle, thought, well, we're already with Hayden in Sweden and Germany, so if Hayden are potentially going to buy Pendragon, then that will be quite tidy, because then we'll have 3 markets with the same partner. I don't know. It may simply be that they looked across the big dealer groups and spoke to Inchcape and spoke to Pendragon and spoke to Virtue and Lucas and a couple of others, and then they thought, no, Pendragon's the one for us. So we don't know what went on in the background there, but as an approach, it will be quite interesting to see, because if they follow the same model as continental Europe, you might see a brand centre in London, a brand centre in Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Cardiff, whatever, run by BYD, and then the rest of the support will come out of that dealer group.
It certainly shows the growth and that kind of move now and we know there are operators already in the UK from some of these Chinese brands, but obviously this is their move into Europe, and then obviously this intention in the UK clearly shows that quick strategic growth from the Chinese brands, doesn't it? And UK being on that growth pattern for them.
Yeah, I mean the Chinese in general, and my experience working with Shanghai Auto, on MG Rover, is that they're actually very patient. We think of them as being very fast moving, but it's not actually the way that they look at their own development in some ways. They see themselves as having been the biggest economy in the world for the vast majority of the last 20 centuries. And they see an inevitability about their return to that position and their expanding presence on the global stage. So they take quite measured steps. And if you look at BYD, then they are quite measured steps. From its foundation, they've taken time to get the product right. They've taken time to start to work into export markets. But it will be a big step, and people like BYD, MG, owned by Shanghai Auto, are likely to be the Chinese brands that we see more often, rather than some of the startups which are on a much faster drumbeat, because they're trying to get into sort of positive cash flow and profitability and so on to meet the needs of their investors.
And just following on from that, Steve, in the announcement from Pendragon, they describe themselves as becoming the lead launch partner. Do you see this scenario playing out with other Chinese brands who aren't yet in Europe or certainly in the UK, partnering up with a big dealer group and launching their presence in the UK that way, rather than trying to have their own sort of physical presence as an OEM?
I think you'll see a mixture. I mean, if you look at some of the startup brands like NIO and so on, then they are following a direct model. Some of them are a bit of a hybrid. With the new brand, you need to get the name out there. I mean, MG had the advantage that people at least recognized the name, albeit clearly the product is completely different to historical MG product. But these others have no name recognition, and so they need to make some sort of splash. And so they've all tended to go for something which has some sort of brand center, some sort of experience store. They all, including BYD, want to control the online channel, which is obviously another way to communicate directly and to educate and inform the buying public, and for them to gather customer insight directly as well, which is important for them. So I think that you're going to see, if you like, Tesla type stores in shopping malls by the Chinese brands. You're going to see one or two big sort of showpiece sites from the Chinese brands. But asking trying to recruit a traditional dealer network is probably not the right first step. And that's why they've taken these other approaches. And you see it with MG, where there was a rush to recruit dealers, and now there's already, in the relatively few years, now going in and culling some of those dealers, because it was just it wasn't a well-targeted, well-focused approach at the beginning.
Well, Steve, as ever, lots of ground that we've covered. So, look, many thanks for your time and for sharing some of your views on the key trends that are impacting car retailing right now, and certainly over the coming weeks and months. So, do come again. Do come back again next month to let us know what's happening. So, many thanks from Phil and I.
No, that's a pleasure, Curtis. I hope that by the time I speak to you again, then I won't be surrounded by quite so much chaos where I'm glancing around, seeing the to-do list for the weekend and all
Just the
around me.
weekend, I think, by the sounds of
Yeah.
it, Steve. I think it's well past the weekend from what you've got ahead of you to sort out. But I think we'll probably get the 3 megabyte download done sorted out first. But yeah, worry about that one later. But again, I mean, fascinating insight, and we could talk about things going on in the market for absolute hours on stuff with you. But thanks again for joining us today on the Motor Trade Radio podcast, and we obviously always appreciate hearing your views. So just for the listeners, anybody who's wanting to see your weekly blogs just needs to head over to ICDP website, and that is icdp.net. Or Steve is clearly on LinkedIn. So just look out for Steve on LinkedIn. He does share his blogs and posts on there, along with the ICDP do as well. So, and that is it from us this week. So thanks for listening to this weekday special, and we'll be back with the normal headlines next weekend.